Okay, thank you everyone for joining for our seminar today. Today's seminar is going to be introduced by a dear colleague of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. Caterina Ciarleglio is a PhD candidate here at the Polytechnic of Turin, and Caterina is doing important work in the Mediterranean, in particular in the city of Athens. So Caterina, please come over here and introduce our guests to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michele. Hi, hello. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Caterina Ciarleglio. I'm part of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab, and I'll be chairing today's seminar, The Mediterranean and Critical Shipwrecks, who has the right to narrate, map, and explain the Mediterranean. We are very pleased to be here and to have with us Iain Chambers, an independent writer and researcher who has long worked on the Mediterranean, cultural and post-colonial studies at the University of Naples, L'Orientale. His recent books include Lampedusa, Gaza, l'orologio coloniale e I linguaggi interrotti, and The Mediterranean Question with Marta Cariello. The seminar will be also discussed by AbdouMaliq Simone, who is Emeritus Professor at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield, and co-director of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab here at the Politecnico di Torino. His work focuses on the production of everyday life and infrastructural imaginaries, particularly in cities in the Global South. Today's seminars invite us into a space of critical reflection. It asks a fundamental question: who has the authority to narrate, map, and explain the Mediterranean? This is not simply a matter of representation, but also an epistemological and power problem. The Mediterranean is often framed through the language of Western objectivity, presented as a coherent and unified space, and yet such perspectives obscure the multiplicity of histories, voices, and lived experiences that traverse it. As this seminar suggests, engaging critically with the Mediterranean requires displacing these dominant frameworks and acknowledging an historical density and cultural complexity that cannot be reduced to a single language or a universal claim. To renegotiate the Mediterranean, then, is to interrupt the linear, homogeneous time of progress which is imposed by colonial modernity. It means confronting what Iain Chambers calls the colonial clock, with other temporalities, those shaped by different histories, rhythms, and ways of inhabiting the world. So the notion of critical shipwrecks, if I understand correctly, evokes precisely these moments of rupture, where established narrative breaks down and new possibilities of understanding emerge. This seminar so invite us not only to rethink the Mediterranean, but also to reconsider our own position within the processes of knowledge production. So thank you for being here again in person and online, and thank you, Iain, for being here with us. I'm looking forward to the discussion later.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Can we have the...
Just a second.
Sorry. Thank you, Catherine. Caterina.
Okay, so I'm just going to share Ian's slide now. Ok.
Va bene.
Vediamo se va. Sì,
Okay.
va.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Caterina, and thank you for coming. And everybody online, thank you for participating. I'm going to try and respond to the summary that Caterina just gave you, see where we can go with it. I'm going to try and propose a form of a critical collage, bringing together different perspectives and thinking about how we can see between the gaps, in the chinks between the framings, perspectives, and the images of the Mediterranean, which allows us to register other histories, other cultures, other lives, composing the Mediterranean in a manner which is not authorized by what, since, let's say, 1800 has been the European version. because of the Mediterranean being changed and transformed into a colonial lake. So in the opening talk of this seminar series, Tatiana Thieme explicitly engaged with Africa, its cultures and philosophies within the ethnographic context of hustle culture in Nairobi, encouraged us to loosen the bonds to Occidental thought and to unwind its colonial legacy. This involves the necessary undoing of existing or inherited categories, deeply implicated in liberal democracy and the racialized hierarchization of the planet, all sustained in the colonial constitution of the present. Perhaps this is what Michele and Simone have proposed as post-categorical thinking, a sort of suspension of existing epistemological protocols across multiple fields and disciplines. It might be considered as also as thinking with the historical and political complexities of the Mediterranean as method, to draw upon the work of Sandra Mezzadra and Brett Nielsen. So what I'm going to try and propose, a bit borrowing from what we heard yesterday from Samia Henny, I guess was sort of like rehearsals of other possible Mediterraneans. And it also raises questions, which we talked about a bit yesterday. It raises questions about language, about our language, which we tend to deploy as though it's a transparent medium. And that idea that language is transparent, this is dominant in the social sciences and the human sciences. Language is only a medium for transmitting knowledge, which is already put together and can be transmitted. This, I would suggest, is also a colonial device. So this is why later I'll talk about the arts as proposing another way of understanding language, which takes us out of that sort of particular prison house of disciplinary logics and ideas of transparency. I will try to work with these proposals in considering the claimed authority of the Mediterranean, given that it is lazily considered as the birthplace of the Logos, Western philosophy, and a modern rationalism that asserts universal rights to explain the world. That too is a colonial practice. In more brutally immediate terms, it poses the question of how to think after Gaza, after genocide. Further, I'll also be thinking in the vicinity of Irene Piano's proposal of interference, drawn in turn from Karen Barad, and the prospect of what we could call quantum history. In other words, unpacking assumed linear and geometrical understandings of space and time, and considering the space-time of the Mediterranean in an altogether more uncertain and fluid framing. It leads to more experimental historiography or speculative sociology, as Sadia Hartman proposes in her work. And of course, bringing all this home, this is also about a reworking using wider maps and much more extensive coordinates of Antonio Gramsci's The Southern Question. As the Nigerian urban critic Daniel Ajiboba recently reminded me, in colloquial English, going south implies some sort of breakdown, potential subtraction, a messing up and a mashup. So a sort of critical collage exploring the gaps and a certain unlearning of the Mediterranean that allows us to drift into other accounts, to better query the desire for coherence and conclusion, and to subtract ourselves from the toxic coloniality, referencing what we talked about yesterday, the toxic coloniality of the present, to better encounter further unauthorized possibilities. So registering that neither space nor time is fixed, this is about inhabiting the landscapes and seascapes of the basin, the Mediterranean, in a critically more open and democratic fashion. It involves recognizing limits, but not in the sense of pushing for a further accumulation of knowledge that leads to adjusting and fine-tuning the existing apparatus, a kind of course 101 in post-colonial and decolonial studies, in geography, urban studies, literature, or history, that seeks to take us through post-colonial syntax into a decolonial universe, That too is a colonial operation. That too is a colonial operation. So I'm not really seeking new categories, but rather staying with the trouble, undoing them, learning to move in the ruins. I cannot abandon that ground, the language it gives me the authority to speak, and its broken language as a broken language, but in refusing to concord and cohere, something else emerges. So this involves querying the premises and protocols that allow a particular narrative to pass, and registering its structural dependence on excluding and dismissing others. The latter are always reduced at most to anthropological footnotes or historiographical footnotes, precisely in order to allow our narrative to establish its universal force and validity. Can the colonizers decolonize themselves? Well, the answer is no. Certainly not without recognizing other histories, cultures, and lives that have been colonized to permit our version of the world to pass. This is a lesson of anti-colonial struggle that targets the asymmetrical relations of power that sustain our language and position, exposing the limits and universal pretensions. The idea that we possess the theoretical and critical keys is a deeply parochial approach. James Baldwin pointed out, those who live beneath the power block understand the world far more deeply and more extensively than those who assume they have the right to explain, define, and control it. So to consider how the construction and undoing of the space-time Mediterranean is fundamentally connected to race and space, which is something I learned when I participated in 2022, Document 15, which was organized by the collector from Jakarta, Rungrupa. It was a forum who invited other collectors, nearly all from the diverse souths of the world. It was a form of like inviting Caliban to participate in this international art event. And of course, it led to people not respecting house rules and proposing other ways to think about modernity, not authorized by the international art market, Kassel, Berlin, London, Los Angeles, etc. And this is all discussed in this volume. Lampedusa Gaza's a couple of chapters devoted to thinking about what happened there and the questions it posed. But above all, it posed the possibility of the world of the arts, suggested the world of the arts, contemporary arts, particularly as proposed through the work of Rungrupa, as providing unsuspected critical spaces. In other words, challenging the paradigm and its assertion of scientific neutrality and critical distance. So it's what about losing count at Kassel? It's about that, the undoing of the idea of critical distance, of scientific neutrality, something about a much more engaged understanding of language, of art, not thinking about producing art as a product for the market or for aesthetical evaluation, but thinking in terms of processes which open up other spaces. So it's an undoing of the Kantian subject who exists to objectify the world, to reproduce his, and the gender is deliberate, his sovereignty. However, we cannot simply discard this critical heritage, for it is a language that also authorizes us. So we're sort of held in a sort of double bind. Although we are held in this double bind, we can nevertheless turn to the challenge of other Mediterraneans and recognize that our language and apparatuses of knowledge can be crossed, folded, cut up, and reassembled by voices, histories, cultures, and lives that it has previously neither authorized nor acknowledged. This is to emphasize a cut on our body of knowledge, a wound that cannot be healed, a wound that cannot be healed, a corpus that will always be incomplete, a wounded epistemology, where the very idea of epistemology, a Western concept of recent origin, concept of epistemology, often promises the illusory universality of an unlimited vision, but it obscures its location in and liminality in time and space as a transitory utterance. So who has the right to narrate? map and explain the Mediterranean. It's a question of power of maps, maps of power. This is a map of the Mediterranean drawn up in London in 1680, and the moment when the English mercantile shipping, along with the Dutch, prepared to take control of its commerce. Second half of the 17th century, nearly all the commerce out of the port of Naples was carried by Dutch and British shipping ships. So it was already the beginning of putting into place a colonial appropriation of the Mediterranean as a mercantile space, but also, of course, eventually more than that. Despite the violent pretensions, our claims on the Mediterranean are a provincial exercise in power. It is a historical configuration, assemblage, and conjuncture, not a timeless arrangement. I'm proposing the abolition of the existing geographical and historical coordinates of the present, drawing upon the intersecting spaces and the temporalities that sustain the composition of other Mediterraneans. This means working with the noise, the interferences that mess up empty, homogeneous time and the flatness of its cartographies. The idea of time is empty, linear, waiting to be filled by progress, our progress. So it's trying to mess that up. But the Mediterranean is never, and never has been, simply ours. The most obvious thing is there's been an Arabic, an Islamic, an Ottoman Empire, Mediterranean as well, and just thinking about more recent times, last 1,000 years. So this requires removing thought from the calculations of Western objectivity and relocating it within the interacting currents that constitute a historical density and cultural complexity that cannot be reduced to a single language or perspective, however universal its claims may be. It's about negotiating the historical and cultural spaces of the Mediterranean that leads us to address a series of far wider issues, not always authorized in European grammar and understandings, or shaped by Western space-time. So this, what I put up here are three so-called historical moments. So one is the Battle of the Pyramids, rival French troops in the Ottoman province of Egypt to seize control of Egypt, 1798. Underneath is the invention of the Middle East because it's halfway between London and the most important colony in the British Empire, India. Division between the French and British mandates, which leads to the invention of all these nation states, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and then permits, through the powers of the British Empire, permits the creation and establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And this is 2016, this young Assyrian girl arriving on the island of Lesbos, fleeing from the civil war in Syria. What I'm suggesting, these three historical moments are not separated, but are interact and interfolded in a shared constellation. That is the colonial constitution of the Mediterranean itself over the last 200 years. So these pasts do not disappear, but accumulate in the present. It's a very simple trick here, like this is the usual understanding of the chronology of historical time and progress, linear time. What I'm suggesting, if we do that, it's just like 1798. It's got something to do with the situation today, Middle East, State of Israel, Palestine, Gaza, etc., refugees, migrants. We do that, see how history acquires depth, sedimentation, stratification, not just flat. And at the same time, the so-called margins unfold towards the center, posing questions that the center itself cannot pose or cannot authorize or does not want to hear. So this is an example. That was previously it was a naval battle, 1798 as well, when the British fleet destroyed that French fleet that had taken Napoleon and his troops to Egypt and to Gaza today. So making an argument, these moments are interwoven in a shared fabric of a colonized Mediterranean, which has become a colonial lake. This means to fold our space-time into others, other space-times and confront how the Mediterranean has been captured, framed, and distilled since 1800 into a colonial lake. So he's breaking up the continuum of empty linear time waiting to be filled by our progress, and to insist that histories simply do not pass, but rather accumulate as traces and interrogations in the present. What is a semi-serious provocation I call quantum history. This is the boat cemetery, Lampedusa, this is 2013. So to think about the interruption of other subaltern Mediterraneans and the multiple souths of the world. Perhaps here it is best to deploy the compass provided by the Algerian writer, feminist, and filmmaker Assia Jabbar, where she says the important thing is not to speak for or in the name of others, yet a further colonial gesture, but close to, nearby, in the proximity, so that my language is creased, contaminated, and undone by the encounter. And this, of course, refers back to my initial comments on the limits of treating language as being transparent. Travelers, as the Iranian anthropologist Shahram Khosravi puts it, people on the move, forcefully displaced, transformed into illegal migrants, raising all sorts of questions about citizenship, rights, residence, legality, ethno-nationalism, and belonging. We heard this discussed in much more detail in the incisive talk by Ania Roy and Veronika Zabrowski a couple of weeks ago, and how it's all about referencing inequality and referencing the question of democracy and rights while seeking a home in the world, which is more than a house or a sanctuary, for it seeks a historical justice and cultural dwelling that permits forms of living for all and not simply being occupied by the over-affluent. It's a radical beyond of not having a home in the world in order to find a better accommodation. Not having a home in the world in order to find a better accommodation. This is, I'm quoting here from Michele Lancione. So thinking about the question of migration, not as a peripheral issue, but as central to the making of modernity. One could write the history of modernity through migration. And it's not, we've all done it. Europeans have done it since 1500 without asking permission of anybody. And they were not being treated as being illegals. So we're thinking about a migratory modernity from the Black Atlantic to the Black Mediterranean, all motored by the brutal cumulative rationality of capital. So again, these three different historical moments. Internet is wants to sleep. Okay, so these three historical moments, the famous thing of the slave ship. This could be a ship leaving Molo-Beverello and Naples, taking migrants in southern Italy, the Mezzogiorno to Buenos Aires and New York, and this is the situation today. Again, making the argument these apparently separate historical moments are actually collated inside a shared constellation called modernity. So to think about in all of this, the contemporary coloniality of Occidental jurisdiction, whereby modern migrants discover themselves to be illegal, discover themselves to be Black, to be racialized and criminalized. The political economy of modernity, whose laws of extraction constantly remind us that capitalism is colonialism. Capitalism is colonialism. From the rationalization aboard the slave ship, the previous slide, I don't know if we can get back there. Rationalization of space, like the rationalization on the plantation, like the rationalization in the factory, etc., etc. Okay. So from the rationalization of space aboard the slave ship to the efficiency of production in the plantation, the factory, the territory, the prison complex, and all manner of human and natural resources for maximum profit, which has always required ecocide, not only genocide, but ecocide. And along with the extermination of native populations, the negation of their cultural and historical rights, again, insisting on holes in time, that past, it does not pass, but continues to intervene, to interrogate, to question the settlement of powers in the present. And so there is a disquieting proximity between the intensive monocultural forms you find in slave plantations to the harvesting of our tomatoes today for €3 an hour. Clearly, some lives matter far more than others. And the racism involved is not an individual pathology to be cured, but a structure of power produced by the racial hierarchization of the planet, what Cedric Robertson famously identified as racial capitalism. From the Black Atlantic to the Black Mediterranean, all intersect in the counter-narratives and what Achille Mbembe has called the becoming black of the world, which relates back to what I quote when I referred to James Baldwin talking about how people under the power block know far more about the world than those who apparently think they control the power block and in their own interest. This all opens up the entangled archives of the colonial constitution of the present, both directly. Italy too had an empire in East Africa from almost the very beginnings of the formation of the modern nation state, the Italian one, because like all modern nation states, you had to be colonial. To be modern was to be colonial 120 years ago. As well as, of course, indirectly from the Italian banking system financing New World conquest and genocides through the Spanish Empire, as Ida pointed out some weeks back, to all that coffee and tomatoes, all your coffee and tomatoes. Without the logistics of colonial networks, those commodities will not be part of Italian lifestyle and identity. Okay. Other histories and holes in time. Palermo. The Arabs were here. The Arabs were here. Islam has been a European religion since 711, the arrival of Berber troops under Arab command in Spain. So it's been present longer in some parts of Europe than Christianity in other parts of Europe. Frederick II, who founded the first secular university in Europe, in Naples, 1224, who was brought up in Palermo, and like his grandfather, Roger II, probably spoke Arabic. He authorized the Northern Crusade of the Order of the Teutonic Knights to conquer Prussia, leading to eventual expansion eastwards into the Baltic region. This was all about eradicating paganism. I'm talking about the 12th century, 13th century. So Islam has been present in some parts of Europe long before Christianity elsewhere. So here there is another thread in the composition of Europe to explore. From the supposedly 300 mosques in Palermo, around 1,000, to male subcultures today, and the racialized criminalization of youth, and the reinterpretation and rerouting of a heterogeneous Islam through hip hop and trap music in the music of Simba LaRue and Baby Gang. There's a really good book that came out recently by Tommaso Satti, Pisciare sulla Metropoli, Pissing on the Metropolis, which explores all this. This is part of what Malik might call the besides of modern urban life, alongside an irreducible to the predictable consensus, where the so-called margins refuse to be margins, and the peripheries refuse to stay put. Here we are also back with subcultural analysis, criminalized youth, and cultural studies at Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies in the 1970s, posing the critical appraisal of moral panics moral panics to male street subcultures, thinking about both the innovations of those analyses and their limits, which was at the same time seeking to accommodate other unauthorized histories. Another example that commences from the heart of your cell phone. And I imagine a lot of people have got those Apple Watches as well. Okay, so, and your computer, of course. Digital numbers, infinite calculation, and the meaning of zero. These are all elaborated by a Persian mathematician in early 9th century Baghdad, Al-Khwarizmi, who introduced the mathematical significance of digital numbers and zero, building on Indian mathematics, along with algebra, that freed thinking from mapping and measuring the world in exclusively visual and geometrical forms. This ushers in an altogether more flexible, ultimately infinite algorithmic calculations, because Al-Khwarizmi, the Latinization of the name becomes algorithmus, algorithm. This is not so much about recovering the archaeology of modern science as about questioning its so-called modern European origins, which reduces Arab science and philosophy to a medieval prehistory. But medieval to whom? Medieval to whom? The Islamic and Jewish worlds of the Mediterranean basin experienced a renaissance some 3 centuries before the European one. The history of European mathematics, architecture, perspective, and optics is inconceivable without it, as Sir Christopher Wren, the 17th century architect of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, always insisted. So though the idea is as though the parable of Europe in the West is autochthonous, as though everything began in Europe, when really, if you look into it, virtually nothing began in Europe. It's as though everything commences from zero on local soil. Here are the Acropolis in Athens, where you can see there's this idea of cleansing the past to ensure that there is this linear narrative whereby the past and its roots continue to be reflected in existing institutional understandings of the present. So the cleansing of the past and the whitewashing of historical memory. What you can see here, these are Muslim tombs because the Acropolis was the mosque of the city of Athens when it's part of the Ottoman Empire for over 6 centuries. And in trying to render the Acropolis more accessible for tourists, all this debris, this historical sedimentation has been removed to create a sort of immediate relationship between 5th century Athens and the present, the narration of the nation today, as though it's now reflected in these ruins. So the remaking of the Acropolis to secure a direct connection across the centuries that reinforces the unproblematical accumulation of linear progress in the narration of the nation. This is from a tomb in Paestum, 5th century before Common Era, about 150 kilometers south of Naples. So inside the tomb, the sarcophagus, the painting, which is popularly known as the tomb of the diver. Well, there's lots of things to say about this, but anyway, thinking with the diver. He's not white. It's part of Greek classical culture and civilization, but he's not white. And at the same time, painted tombs are not characteristic of Greek tombs, but specific to the region of Lucania in southern Italy. Hybridity at work. There was a crossing of local culture, the painting of tombs was drawn from local culture and incorporated into Greek culture. Processes of creolization that erode the notion of the purity of origins of white European civilization that modern Europeans sought to establish with scientific racism in the second half of the 19th century and by whitewashing the mythical past. Romari Bearden's Black Odyssey invites us to consider the Caribbean school of the Black Atlantic, Amir Césaire and Frantz Fanon, thinking about colonialism, C.L.R. James on the Black Jacobins, Edouard Glissant on archipelago thinking and the rights to opacity, Sylvia Wynter on the limits of Occidental humanism, Stuart Hall and the making of cultural studies. Again, to consider the racial hierarchization of the planet and its centrality to Occidental modernity, but to think about it differently, from Haiti to Gaza. Some lives count more than others. Rethinking the Occidental canon and its philosophy in the light of this critical archipelago that I just named. This critical archipelago has been so central to the making of modernity. If we are willing to consider Frantz Fanon a philosopher, what then happens to the assumption that the West is philosophy and philosophy is the West? So these are also archives sustained in the sea, further histories suspended in water that also frustrate the terracentric understandings. We assume that knowledge is always about being on land and on solid soil. This is a challenge to terracentric powers and institutions, those pedagogical and political apparatuses of the Occident that seek to render the world transparent to its will. But here, critical field work is supplemented by the altogether less stable coordinates of sea work and of being at sea. Being at sea in English also means being lost. We have to renegotiate where you are. Here are histories, cultures, and lives sustained in altogether more fluid archives that propose critical journeys without guarantees, as Stuart Hall would put it. So what lies under the waves and outside the frame? Following this black chained leg, a slave has been thrown overboard, takes us out of the frame and proposes we can inhabit another space to reconsider the history of the Atlantic. This is, of course, the famous work done by Paul Gilroy. So it's proposing other histories of modernity from far, far below. Bob Marley's bottomless pit. Bob Marley? Bob Marley's bottomless pit. So following the black chained leg out of the frame into Paul Gilroy's Black Atlantic and then onto the drowning migrant in today's Black Mediterranean is to follow deeper histories and deeper currents, whereas Derek Walcott put it, history is sea, or the sea is history. So the idea is to think about how the arts provide another unsuspected critical space that refuses the conclusive drive of disciplinary rationalities and proposes other reasons of the body, of the senses, beyond the closure of existing representations, exiting from the frame, reworking and repeating languages of modernity to release other histories, cultures, and lives. So Delacroix is recycled, repeated, in order to release other tellings of space-time. To consider the repression that permits a certain representation to appear and not another, to insist on the chinks in the image, the glitches in language, and the refusal to cohere while pursuing historical and cultural justice. Okay, there's never enough time, right? Okay, so, oops, help, Ayuto. So we're going to see two video sequences. One is from this. Burkina Visconti is the Galpapago, and underneath is a sequence from the Isaac Julian, the Black British artist, Western Union small boats, and uses the same space, Palazzo Gangi in Palermo, same space provided by the same languages of cinema, European aesthetic, concepts of the beautiful, etc. But it's telling something else, another story, using the very same space and languages.
Perché se lei non avesse voluto, certamente finiva sul Tancredi che avrebbe sposato la sua. Eri tutta a te sola. No, non è vero. Sì, è vero, Angelica. Nessun Tancredi avrebbe resistito alla tua bellezza. Avevo sentito dire di lei che era un buon ballerino, principe. Mi dispiace di averti ancora delusa. È molto di più di un buon ballerino. Lei è un ballerino delizioso. Veramente delizioso. Ma sì, è mio padre. Sì, però. La mazurka, allora. Mi stanno guardando tutti, principe. Che splendida ragazza che balla con suo padre. È molto, molto penso. Caro zio, se gli applausi non sono scrosciati è solo perché un leone della tua specie incute il rispetto non incoraggia sconvenienze. Ma ti meritavi un'ovazione. E ora sai?
Oops, now it works. So this is the Algerian artist, Baye. When at 16 years old, she was taken to Paris in 1946. She was adopted by the Surrealist movement, and the art critics of time they tried to define her works, her art. Some saying it was naive, folkloristic, others saying it was avant-garde, surrealistic, and Baye refused all the categories, refused to be confined and defined in those categories of art history and of European culture. So she claimed her right to opacity, as Guisson would put it. And thinking about how the categories and the most obvious ones, the broadest ones of, I don't know, national language, literature and identity, cannot contain the his stories and her stories that cross, undo, and renew the becoming of belonging below, through, and beyond the confines of the nation state. And this, of course, these are Black Italians writing in Italian language and Italian literature, so they're proposing another way of being Italian, even though it may not yet be recognized or registered by many authorities in the field, including those who decide the school curriculum, but it's happening. I'm going to have to rush through this because this is, I'll jump this. Just to say, this film, The Battle of Algiers, which explains so many things about today, like what is terrorism. It's all very well explained in film. It's the right of militant reply to an occupying colonial force, the right of armed resistance, the FLN. So if I have to condemn, just put it brutally, if I have to condemn Hamas, I have to condemn the FLN. I have to condemn the Viet Cong. I have to condemn Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress. I have to condemn Frelimo in Mozambique and so on. And it's very well explained in the film, the Gila Pontecorvo. So today there's no celebrations. It's the 60th anniversary of the film coming out. It's complete silence here. And the thing here as well about thinking about in the repetition, what I've been trying to talk about, the repetition through thinking about Assia Jabbar or Isaac Julian in the film as well. This film, The Battle of Algiers, the repetition, the mimicry that permits another Algeria to emerge. The Algerian women carrying bombs into the European quarters and who refuse to remain in their designated colonial place and transform the colonizers' understanding of Arab femininity and racial legibility into a weapon. They pass, carrying the bombs into the European quarters. Okay, so this is a famous building in Algiers used by the French parachutists in their torturing of Algerians of the FLN, and who from their bodies were discarded or thrown directly into the sea, which then becomes that work actually, sorry, is by the Algerian artist Zineb Sedira, Haunted House, the haunting of the present that refuses to go away, the ghost that can persist. And thinking of Samir's talk yesterday, Samir Henny's talk yesterday, contesting the colonial narratives that continue to exercise their violence and modernity and the violence in modeling the architecture or the architectures of oppression and the political landscapes of the present. And so, speaking of the West and its Mediterranean, leaves us with a broken archive, The debris and rubble needed to be assembled into a further accounting of modernity and its space-time. Facing space-time, facing modernity not as a problem to be fixed, disciplined and brought back under control, but rather critically unpacking it and seeking accommodation in its ruins. I would suggest the Mediterranean is an exemplary laboratory of this. For example, here amongst many, there exists another Mediterranean, traced in sounds, musical maps, traced in sounds between geographical, historical, and aesthetic shores, where cultural coordinates, along with past, present, and potential future histories, are all folded into the musical mix. It produces an inconclusive journey, a sort of Mediterranean blues, endlessly repeating and simultaneously renovating its questions. It reminds us that language is never transparent. And if language is all that remains, as Hannah Arendt put it, contemplating the ruins of post-1945 Europe, or we today, as we confront the obscene genocide of Gaza and the ongoing mortification of migrants, then we need to learn how to inhabit its precarious power in order to narrate, think, and be differently. So I will conclude on perhaps a slightly lighter note with Seun Kuti, who's one of the sons of Fela Kuti, the Nigerian musician, who in 90 seconds offers a neat synthesis of what I've been trying to say. It perhaps corresponds to what Michele calls liberating home in Europe.
But I have an advice for young people in Europe. I know you want to free Palestine, you want to free Congo, you want to free Sudan, you want to free Iran. There's a new one every week. Free Europe. Free Europe from right-wing extremism. Free Europe from fascism. Free Europe from racism. Free Europe from imperialism. When you do this job, as soon as you do this job, Gaza will be free, Congo will be free, Sudan will be free, Iran, forget about us, don't worry about it. Free Europe.
Okay, thank you. See the power of music beyond the petty power of words.
Yep. Okay, Malik, come over.
I must admit, I didn't have a clue about what you were going to say. So,
Going south.
so let's go south. Consider this a kind of accompaniment rather than a commentary. Just over a decade ago, Michele wrote a very groundbreaking book called The Physics of Blackness, where she points to the occlusion of all the slave ships and all the holds that were wrecked on the way, and also the wreckage of the primacy of the Middle Passage as the hegemonic account of blackness. And taking physics seriously, looked at blackness as a kind of superimposition of temporalities, of stories, of accounts. So how to navigate the multiple, sometimes abyssal instantiations of blackness. And so some Black scholars, such as Amy Meredith Cox and Deborah Thomas, try to forefront the notion of choreography. Choreography is both method and parontology. And here, in terms of sort of Black scholarship, choreographies are not written scores, not maps or guidelines for how to move. Rather, they are the active traces of movements underway and their anticipated trajectories. It's how things pass through and with each other. The circulations of touch and gesture, of words and shouts, of toing and froing, where there are just too many leads to follow, too many possibilities of where to move one's body, but also too many rules, too many things to pay attention to, too many injunctions not to see what you see or feel. But things have their desires, their inclinations. They are lured or repelled, and movement is never free, never a matter of doing what one wants, but decisions got to be made in terms of how and which way to move. And these decisions are implicitly collective ones. So everyone and everything that moves is offered a part of a much larger story. And what Iain is offering us tonight is the possibility of being a part of a much larger story. But just think of all the things that are taking place in this district where we're situated right now. All the simultaneities that we do not directly experience. But because everything is in motion and nothing is static, a sense of all those things is also put in motion, also circulates, also is partly available to us, even though we can't always identify who did what to who or where things come from exactly. Something is always happening in ways that can't be predicted or controlled or read. This is choreography. That which is left out of history, seen as not important or useful. But the popular is in some ways largely about engaging this uselessness, these indeterminacies, something that has no apparent value but still can make things happen. And these are all the intercalated operations of extending, documenting, distributing, mapping, transporting, and coordinating that choreograph materials and actors into some kind of mutual relevance and resourcefulness. It's always provisional and vulnerable, It's not based on the certainty of conviction, but the fleeting moments where that which is immediately available enables an unprecedented orientation to what might ensue. A different kind of story, a different kind of storytelling. So take some examples. Take the well-worn term from Jakarta, a term they call spiraling, where everything is a matter of spiraling. Circulations outward from a base with which one is identified with, familiar, administratively linked to, and instead to gather up experiences, momentary alliances, and information, and circling back, not to an original point of departure, but to the edges of the territory, prompting the borderlands of the familiar and unfamiliar with new instigations and prompts before moving outwards again across wider expanses in new territories. In Sao Paulo, some youth are known as Rosinhos, which literally means little walks, that spiral across the city or on seemingly arbitrary itineraries, gathering here and there, from public squares to shopping malls to empty fields, all claiming to be along for the ride. And here, riding refers to moving across the distinctive rhythms and flows of specific territories, as well as riding in the sense of possessing, taking the movements of others as one's own. Young people ride, for example, from one suara, poetry event, to another, assembled in various places and circuits across the city, journeys that often cover great distances. Experiences, impressions, associations are gathered up along the way. Some are deployed for specific incursions. Others are dispensed with in favor of new trajectories. The spiral itself becomes a kind of collective, kind of popular territory, taking a shape that depends on continuous movement, the continuous creation of peripheries for any location or situation, and where the peripheral acts to constitute a space of relative protection, subterfuge, non-committal actions, and a source of propositions for future movement. Spirals, as such, are always interstitial, but also have their own infrastructures and economies that might include all-night cafes, temporary jobs and boarding rooms, stolen vehicles, community assemblies and mission houses, underpasses and shopping malls. Spirals are a means of touching, staying in touch, being once removed from touch, which resist the debilitating aspects of the hold, the slave ship, the hold that a place exerts, obligates, or promises. And these practices of circulation are intensely related to the ways in which spatial production in working poor districts, suburbs, and peripheries has become a political commodity. And I'm particularly concerned about, what happens to the popular territories of the Mediterranean, from Bar Shifa to Bougainville to Hazmia to Secondigliano. Far from being simply a domain of reserve and extracted labor or a bastion of informalities or the locus of exclusion, these popular territories are increasingly viewed as a source of exchange and political value. And the extraction of this value largely depends on a collectivity of actors and practices that must be assembled within an intricate array of protocols, financial arrangements, promises, moralities, and technologies. While structurally facing similar conditions, the lack of public investment and maintenance of infrastructure and service, often disadvantaged locations relative to employment, the over-reliance on various forms of informal and small-scale entrepreneurship, predatory policing, and complicity with illicit economies. Each of these popular territories has its own specificities, its own political compositions, and genealogies of power. So with and beyond discernible vernacular, and they exist within and beyond discernible vernaculars of the colonial, often ambiguating who is captured to whom and in what game and in what time. in a series of interruptions and superimpositions and contiguities. It's a story of physics and the physics of innumerable and incalculable stories.
AbdouMaliq.
Sure, I can dance with that. In the sense that I think, first of all, at Documenta 15 in 2022, there was an art collective called Black Quantum Futurism, which raised many of these questions about Black temporalities. At the same time, I don't feel I can speak for, and this is to insist on Assia Jabar's advice, I can't speak for Black temporalities, but I can speak alongside while listening. And it means, in a way, it also allows me to introduce something else which I didn't really talk about, which I think is very important, is the move, I would say, the critical move from ideas of representation, which we all do. When we have to create an object to study, we have to somehow repropose it, represent it, to move from that to thinking about ideas of registering, which implies, again, with music, the voice, elements which are not under my control. Music sounds come to me without being produced by me. So they disable some idea that I, as a subject, can reduce the world to objects that I can then explain and represent. So begin to think in terms of registration, which leads us to a much wider space, cultural space, political space, historical space, which we do not necessarily frame or control. And it also it allows me to think a bit about, which you expressed so beautifully, the question of aesthetics or aesthetics ethics or poetics, how poetics permits us to exceed or move beyond the frame which we call the political. It poses questions which the political often, in its attempts to rationalize power and to rationalize the responses to power, is unable to capture those ambiguities, that darkness which sustains something more, which exceeds a simple rationalization of power in the political format. So the excess of the borderlands, I recognize Gloria Anzaldúa in that, the excess of the borderlands that escapes in the spirals, the spirals. And it's all very much about being recognizing what is how it is all contingent. That operates, as Stuart Hall would put it, without guarantees. It's all contingent. And then sort of listening to, responding to, without seeking to capture those popular, specific but popular rhythms of the space-time of modernity. That's not an answer, but I mean, it's a beginning of a, we can dance on that again. So thank you.